Welcome everyone to the Lyfebulb webinar series in the area of organ transplant. Today I'm really happy to have such a great panel of speakers, real experts in the space. And our focus today is myths regarding transplant, especially focused on Hollywood. And we have a very esteemed guest here from LA who has tremendous experience with handling such myths. And we have also two organ transplant recipients here, actually including myself. But I'm going to introduce everyone, and then I'm going to ask all of our panel members to say a few words about your background, and then we'll just get right into the seminar. As you know, this is a recorded session, so if you would like, you can go back and listen to it and let your friends know that this is an interesting topic to go back and listen to. So first, I want to welcome Tanaya Wallace with Donate Life Hollywood, and really the one sitting on most of the information on these myths and how to also debunk those myths, because it is really critical that the reality of an organ transplant, it is such an interesting event to feature for a movie or a TV series, but the impact on people, it can be detrimental if it is falsely described. And we do not want behavior to be impacted in a negative way or in a way that pushes people to be involved in the area of transplant for the wrong reasons. Now we have Shelby Hansen, who is our Lyfebulb ambassador and champion on TransplantLyfe, who is herself a transplant recipient, and Daniel Garza, who is also an ambassador and a champion on our newest platform that we are officially launching next year, but I can hint to it, and it is Rare Cancer Life. So Daniel is really here to ask some of the questions. Coming from the non-transplant world, we're counting on Daniel to ask questions that he has heard and maybe he still believes. So Daniel, I'm gonna give the floor to you first, just if you want to add to what I said about you briefly, and then maybe ask a question of Tanaya or Shelby. And you know, of course, I am also a transplant recipient in addition to the CEO of Lyfebulb, but I'm going to try to stand back a little bit here and let our experts respond to the question.
Excellent, thank you. Well, first of all, welcome to everybody who's watching us today. This is an open conversation, so please, I believe the chat might be open, so if you have any questions, fill those in. For my position today is actually as somebody who's outside of the how would I say the
transplant community.
Thank you. Out of the transplant community, more of an observer, and to help debunk some of the myths that are put out by Hollywood. And I guess the first thing that I would ask is, does everybody qualify to be a donor? And can we all just sign up and be donors at any time that we want to?
It's a good question. It's one of the questions that we have been really emphasizing with the entertainment industry to show who can be a donor and how you get how someone becomes an organ donor. And this past 3 years, we've been working very closely with the medical shows, and really a focus on having them show brain death and brain death testing, making sure that people understand that in order to become an organ donor, you actually have to have a very severe head trauma, and then either become a donor after cardiac death that still had a head trauma, or become brain death, and then you become an organ donor after that. That's one of the reasons why that there is such a shortage of organs, is because less than 1% of people who die, less than 1%, die in a manner that allows them to become an organ donor. So with tissue donation, tissue transplantation, there is no shortage of tissue. If you needed a cornea tomorrow, you could get one. And a large part of that is because the vast majority of people die in a way that they cardiac arrest, and then tissue donation is much more of a possibility. So the manner of death, how someone dies, and that brain aneurysm, car accident, any kind of head trauma. My friend, her brother was re-siding the house and up on a ladder and pulling siding off the house, fell off the ladder, head trauma, and became an organ donor many years ago now on Thanksgiving weekend. But so these are very sudden accidents that occur where people can become organ donors. They're taken to the hospital. Everything is done to try and save their life. And if that's not a possibility, then organ donation is considered.
Because you just mentioned
And
something.
Daniel,
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
just I think we want to add to that is that has to do with disease donors, right? So when you are a living donor, it is of course a different question. Individuals who donate kidneys and livers, you can of course sign up to be a donor. And as we've heard on our seminars with Columbia Presbyterian, there really is a very large age range from where you can donate a kidney. Personally, I got my kidney from my father, and at the time he was 63 years old. And in the past, you would say, oh, anyone over 60 shouldn't be donating a kidney, but it really depends on the health status of the individual. So there are many components that go into the assessment of who can be a living donor, including the medical status, the psychological status, the support, the social support, the financial, resources of the individual, and they need to be assessed pretty thoroughly to see if they first of all really want to be a donor. You have to be volunteer. You can't be pushed into it, and that is very much evaluated. And if they pass all the medical and psychological analysis, then it's the question if they have the resources to go through such a situation. So there's really not an opportunity for everyone to be a donor, but I think to everyone out there who's considering to be a living donor, please do reach out to organizations that can assess and test, because we do have a huge need for more donors. And also those who are considering to be an organ donor after they die, please really consider it, because you do have to, it is preferred if you sign up yourself versus that the family has to be asked after you're done.
All right. So let me just take it back just a second, so the people that out there listening have a clear idea, because coming from, again, I'm speaking for the audience. We know about kidney, liver, heart, lungs, but then you just mentioned cornea and tissues. The list of things that can be donated is much bigger than we believe. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, Hollywood very rarely takes on tissue donation. You hardly ever see it. Living donation, living kidney donation in particular, and living liver donation have both been part of storylines, even chain donations. So it's great to see Hollywood taking on living donation, although they are starting to build out some myths and misconceptions on living donation as well. I'm like, what is up with you? But yes, when somebody, if you are an organ and tissue donor after you've passed away, then you can save up to 8 lives with organ donation, and up to 75 with tissue. You can support and change. And a lot of people have had tissue and used tissue, and they don't even know it. It's used in dental reconstruction. It's used for a variety of different things that you might even not know that your doctor is using it. But if you have cancer, you can, in the bone, you can take out a portion of that bone and put in a segment of donated bone, and so you won't have to lose your leg or your arm or wherever that cancer is. So it's an incredible opportunity to save lives and to support and give people a second chance at life through tissue donation also.
And I want to bring Shelby into the conversation. So as I'm watching one of my favorite medical dramas, fill in the blank, whichever it is, they are at home and all of a sudden they're like, Shelby, you need to get to the hospital now because we have your liver. So get here. Does it happen that way? And what was the story behind the story to get you to your transplant?
For me, I actually got my phone call on the 4th of July in 2018, and I was at a friend's house at their cabin. I was paddleboarding out on the lake behind them, and I had left my phone because I was in the water in their house. And so they had kept calling me over and over again. I had like 25 missed calls, and it wasn't family that I was with, so they didn't know whose phone it was. They finally were telling me somebody's calling you and they won't stop calling. So yes, they do try to contact you as much as they can, because time is of the essence a lot of the times with the deceased donors, and they need to know whether you're a yes or a no so they can know where to send the organ. And I was able to get back home and get back to the hospital, but my donation actually didn't occur until almost midnight on July 6th.
It depends, Daniel, on the organ. With the heart, you have much less time. With the kidney, you have a little bit more time, up to 36 hours. But it actually is one of the myths that is somewhat true. The calls do happen. It actually is the surgeon who normally places the call. They call the first person who is on the list, and if that person is not able to make it, then they go down the list. The organs can be preserved somewhat with today's technology, but we're basically talking about ice and some perfusion. So it is important to get to the hospital pretty fast. I can tell you personally, I had a laminated flight schedule with me at all times in a little bag packed, because I was ready to go when my pancreas was going to come, and because it was going to be in Minnesota and I lived in New York City. But so it is kind of dramatic.
I always think of that. I'm sorry. I always think of that scene in Still Magnolias where they're talking about transplants, and they put it in a cooler with ice and a 6-pack of beer, and I'm like, no. For people out there, I'm sure they don't have a 6-pack of beer in their cooler as they're going out.
Probably not mixed.
And what's interesting is that now a lot of television shows have started to show the different ways that organs are transported. So there's these little things that you put the organ in, and it can perfuse the organ, which can allow the organ, like a heart. Now it used to be has to go there quickly. Now it can actually extend the time. So Chicago Med did a whole piece on that. That was almost like a little PSA for this company that does that. So a lot of television shows are getting hit to the fact that it's no longer a cooler with ice in it, but there's these technology components that are very visual, very interesting. And that also help to preserve the organs for longer so that they can last outside of the body longer and they can go farther away. So television loves cool technology.
Before we continue, I want to just read some of the comments that are put. I just had an abdominal repair with donated tissue, and her dad is.
By the way, that happened in Grey's Anatomy. So it's really interesting. One of our community managers just mentioned that she had an abdominal repair transplant, which is a really very serious surgery. And congrats, Alicia, to be back. And that was featured, and you could probably know it, Tanaya, in Grey's Anatomy.
Sweet.
Grey's Anatomy. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to read the other comment. Brooke says, I'm a liver recipient from a deceased donor, and I only knew about transplant from medical dramas on TV. And Terry says, that's why we don't silence our phones. And Alicia says she got an Apple Watch just to make sure that she got the calls. What were you going to say, Tanaya?
Grey's Anatomy did a really good, Grey's Anatomy, the early days of Grey's Anatomy was really bad. They did they were just like myth-filled. And my favorite moment of my career in working with Donate Life Hollywood was when I was talking on the phone to one of the Grey's Anatomy researchers. So they have all these people who do the medical research. So I was on the phone with the person, talking about a recent episode that wasn't so good. And she's like, yes, Tanaya, I know we have all of your letters here in a file, because I used to write these very extensive letters that were like, okay, here's what you did well, here's the truth, and I was like, well, read the letters, come on, people. But then I really do, I'm going to take full credit that hearing from our community, it wasn't just letters from me, but from around the country, that it really does influence how writers will write about storylines. And they started to pay attention, and you start to see a real shift in Grey's Anatomy writing in like the second season. And the opening episode, the premiere episode of this season, was essentially a PSA about organ donation. It talked about the myths, or it talks about the number of people waiting, and it had brain death testing. It was amazing to see. And then Grey's Anatomy last season had a lovely piece about organ donation as well. So I would say the early days of Grey's Anatomy, not so good, but the later seasons of Grey's, they really have done quite a good job of representing our cause.
Cool. Now we started to talk a little bit about the mental, spiritual, and physical aspects of being a recipient. So I'm going to bring Shelby back into the conversation and talk about spiritually, physically, mentally after your transplant. Where were you?
I think that there is this myth that if you get an organ from somebody, that maybe you might take on some of their personality traits, or that you might start to like things that you didn't like before. And there's been some things that people will say, oh, that's because of medications. That could be part of it. For me personally, I'm somebody that always liked really salty foods. And after my transplant, I just had such a sweet tooth. And so also there's high dose prednisone. So that could be part of it. That was pretty much the only change that I noticed, other than at different holidays. Honestly, like especially around Christmas, I just kind of find myself feeling like a little bit more down and sad, not personally, but I think about my donor and that how their family is not celebrating with them. And I don't know spiritually if that's like part of my body is mourning that they're not with their family. Like, it's out there, but who knows what, like how the spiritual and implications. But personally, that's been the only changes for me, emotionally, physically.
One of the comments that is popping up right now on the chat is that the way it's portrayed, that everything is just quick and easy. Here you have the surgery, and the next week you're off in Hawaii having a vacation. Everything's great. How long can the process be? Is it the same for everybody, or does it vary?
It varies, but it varies per organ, and it varies per age, and it varies per comorbidities. I would say that for a kidney transplant, it's about 1 to 2 months until a person is back to doing some normal things and maybe even working. For a heart, it's longer. For a lung, it's much longer. So it depends on the organ. It depends on what kind of state. There was also a comment here that there's a myth that you have to be on dialysis before you get a kidney. And that's of course not true. There are a lot of preemptive kidney transplants, like Shelby and myself. We never were on dialysis. So, that's the ultimate goal, right, is to avoid dialysis. Dialysis is really a bridge to a transplant. It is hopefully the case for most, but it is not the case for most. The question, it's not quick. It's going to take time. And it's both the surgical portion of it, the process of the surgery that you have to recover from, but it's also the new medications. The medications as you start are pretty heavy, and the medications that are given to you in the hospital just immediately after the transplant are very heavy immune suppressive medication. So it takes a toll on the body, and the beginning of new kinds of medication will also make you nauseous, will make you tired, more prone to infection. So you will take months probably before you're back to normal, and emotionally it could take much longer.
That's interesting. We have a couple of different comments. One, Robert is saying after his transplant, he started writing with his left hand after being right-handed for so many years. And where was it? Oh, and he was swinging golf clubs 3 weeks later. So good for you, Robert. That's pretty awesome. Let's talk a little bit more. Oh, go ahead.
I will say that's the thing, is that I know a lot of transplant recipients, and And many of them have had different things that have happened post-transplant, even things where they like something that they've never liked before, and then they meet the donor family, and the donor family is like, oh my God, yes, my loved one loved that thing. And so there are these kind of connections that happen. And that wouldn't be a problem, I don't think, like on television and movies. But the problem is that Hollywood takes this to the extreme, right? They take it to such an extreme that you get a heart transplant and now you become a murderer, right? You become possessed. You become, that's it, the fact that what Hollywood does is takes these anecdotal and even some research studies that say there can be some pieces that you've changed or what have you, and taken that to an extreme of a horror sci-fi genre that is scary. And I never really thought that would stop people from being donors, because when I look at a television show, I'm always like, okay, is this realistic? Because nothing's realistic on television, really. They're always going to truncate timelines. They're always going to miss certain steps. They never talk about an organ procurement organization, which is essential in the deceased donor process. And you've never even heard of one because one's never been on Grey's Anatomy. So they're not going to get it quite accurate. But is it authentic, and is it going to scare people? But I was talking to a transplant surgeon about this, and he said, well, the thing is that those stories about getting an organ and then taking on the murderous tendencies of the donor had actually stopped some of his patients who needed a transplant from wanting to get listed and wanting to get a transplant. So I hadn't really thought of it through the lens of the impact that it may have on someone who would be a possible recipient. I'm always looking at, is this going to scare people? Is it going to stop people from wanting to put that dot on their license and be part of the donor process? So actually some of these myths and misconceptions, I think, can be harmful to the people who are potentially recipients as well.
So let's just clarify for people out there. If by chance you happen to pick up, I die and you get my corneas, you will not automatically know Spanish and like tacos all of a sudden. There's more to that. So let's clear that up. But let's throw some facts out there, because say for instance, when I was in my 20s, I remember signing up to be a donor. Through the process of my years, I'm 51 now. Should I have changed that? Will my health affect if I'm still a donor? Do I have to renew anything to continue to be a donor?
No, and we always say never rule yourself out. So it doesn't matter what kind of, if you have diabetes, if you have cancer, if you are HIV positive, we're doing HIV to HIV transplants. If you have hepatitis C, we're actually able to take an organ from a hepatitis C positive patient, put it into a patient who is not hepatitis positive, hep C positive, and cure the hepatitis within the transplant recipient. That's where we've gotten to. So, the other thing is that people who are in need of an organ, this is it for them. That, many people, they're going to die the next day, complete liver failure, heart disease, other kinds of things. You're going to die without this organ. So you might joke and be like, oh, I drink so much wine, no one's going to want my liver. It's like, yeah, that's a different level of need. And so oftentimes these organs, even if they're older organs or not perfect, they can offer a bridge to the next transplant, and that gives people a second chance at life. So we, the oldest donor was in their 90s who was a tissue donor, but even organ donors in their 80s. So please, if you're registered as a donor, just stay registered as a donor. What will happen is after everyone's worked to save your life, if that's not a possibility and organ donation is, then the organ procurement organization will do an assessment and evaluate your health at that point in time, and determine what organs and tissue could be viable. So never rule yourself out.
Ultimately, it is the patient and the physician who will make the decision. So the patient gets presented. If the patient is, somewhat conscious, they will be part of the decision, and they're being presented with an organ that comes from an older, so-called older donor and high-risk donor. They can say no. It's up to them. This is of course not going to happen if you're on your deathbed and you need an organ that day. You'll take what you can get. But there are cases such as kidney and, when a person is on dialysis, a person is waiting for a pancreas, they can decline, and it can move to another person who may be in a different position where, an older recipient is a better match for an older donor. Even though that, of course, is going to lead to an even worse result because they will have a shorter life, but they also don't have as much of a life ahead of them. So all that will be decisions to be made ultimately by the surgeon and the patient. But again, I think no one should rule out being a donor. And the other myth that I think is really important to debunk is the idea of this super match, right? And I remember it from Billions last year or 2 years ago when the father of the attorney needed a kidney, and it's always the same plot that, oh, we discovered now that it actually isn't the child. It's not the father of the child. And that's kind of the plot, right? Because they don't have the blood group that works. It couldn't be the father. And this was, of course, before paternity tests were done, more regularly. So now the story is the following, that if you don't have a perfect match, you can still either actually get that organ because it can be donated anyway. And even more often, you can do a so-called chain where you could donate that organ to someone else, and that other person will donate, that donor will give it to that first person. So those are these cross matches and chain transplants that actually work very well, and can be several patients that can be saved through it, through the kidney registry and other places.
Interesting. So before we run out of time, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that one of the biggest ones that I see with Hollywood is that people think that the surgeon is not going to save you, and that they just want your organs to give to somebody else. And I think that that's a plot that really gets exploited in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about that.
I would say that I have this little thing. Oh, actually, hold on. It's my rule of 3 when I'm talking to writers. And the first one is to help us debunk a myth. So the number 1 myth is they won't work as hard to save you if you're a donor. So work with Donate Like Hollywood to help us debunk that myth. Second is to drop the punchline. So drop the I'll have to sell a kidney to afford that joke, because it creates a distrust in the system that there's some sort of payment ongoingly and that's just something you can do. And the third one is to go beyond the shortage. So people know that there's a shortage of organs. That's the number 1 thing people know about. They don't know much about organ donation, but they know there's a shortage. They don't know that less than 1% of people can be donors, and that's why the shortage. And so what happens is that the conflict is about that shortage. There is somebody who's desperate to live and not enough organs available. And so then what Hollywood does is it throws in all of the horrible parts of humanity, the greed and the deceit and all the things that you might do, rather than what we all get to see, which is generosity and kindness and giving and the very best of humanity. I always say organ donation represents the very best of humanity, that people are willing to give while they're alive. On their worst day, a family looks beyond themselves and gives life to somebody they don't know and may never meet. That is the best of humanity. But because the shortage is the conflict, then what Hollywood does is it creates the worst of humanity and says, we're going to buy it, we're going to steal it, we're going to take it, we're going to do whatever it takes, especially if you're wealthy, and extrapolates that out. And I think that is really where Hollywood goes wrong, and where I want to right the ship, is to have Hollywood show that organ donation represents the very best of who we are.
So
not the worst.
Thank you for that, Tanaya. And before we go and run out of time, and just like in the movies, as let's come to the end, let's find that moment. So Shelby and Mary Karin, do you always get a chance to meet the family of the donors when they pass? Is there always that moment where they meet together and the stethoscope and they put their heart and everybody cries and some sad music is playing in the background? Because we all love, I mean, let's face it, we love those endings. But does it always happen that way?
Very rarely. Shelby, why don't you take it?
Yeah, same. I don't know my deceased donor. I've written to them, but I haven't heard back from them.
Yeah, I got my pancreas 13 years ago, and I write every year, but I don't expect an answer. I don't think I'll ever get an answer. I mean, it was a 22-year-old, a 21-year-old girl, died in an asthma attack. I think her parents are not, they get the letter, and hopefully they appreciate it, but it's pretty traumatic, and having to write back, the act of writing back, takes a lot to do that, I think. Most people don't know their donors, and don't know the donor family, and that's kept very, very secret. I mean, that's kept very separate for that reason. Of course, your living donor, and that's a separate conflict. Because if you have a living donor, like I also have, I have my father, so that obviously is someone that you are, close to and speak to and grateful to for the rest of your life.
So we're running out of time, but let me just, before we go, yes, everybody should donate. Everybody, you can save a life, so why not do it? They're asking if you consulted Tanaya on the show Be Positive. I actually like that show, so I don't know.
Okay, yes, I have mixed feelings about that show too. We did give it an award because the first episode, he gets the information that he has kidney failure, and they talk about transplant right away. And I think that is really, really important, is that they didn't, that's a conversation. A lot of people have a conversation, they're in kidney failure, and then they get sent to dialysis, not that they get sent to transplant right away. So that's something that we really thought was very positive. It was based on the real story of the creator of the show, Marco Panett. And what we were able to do is get a 15-second PSA about living donation on 3 episodes during Kidney Month that led to 21,000 people going to the website within that time frame, and 5 people starting the process of living donation just in that month. And we've heard more people have actually referenced the Be Like Gina campaign as the reason why they chose to become a living donor. So I wasn't upset that they changed the format, and that it's gone off the air, but it was a very exciting opportunity to work with CBS, and we definitely pushed for that. So anytime, it's beyond storylines, but those partnerships with the entertainment industry is something that we're very always looking to develop.
Excellent. As we're heading out tonight, last thoughts for the folks watching us.
If you see stuff on television and you're annoyed, you're not alone. But you can download the DLH Activate app. So on whatever kind of phone you have, DLH Activate app. And what we will do is send you notifications about any storylines that are on television, good or bad. And then it'll have a pre-created social media piece. You just hit send and it'll go out on your social media. Hollywood responds to us when we speak with one voice. When we speak together and say, hey, pay attention to us, we're not just a storyline, we are a cause, we are real people. And Hollywood impacts the public's perception of donation like nothing else does, both positive and negative. But they have to hear from all of us in order to change their ways. So please be part of Donate Life Hollywood's efforts through the DLH campaign. And then we also have a website, Access DLH, which is really just intended for writers, but you can get more about what Donate Life Hollywood is doing on the website as well.
Sweet. And they're asking for your links on the chat if you can tonight. Shelby, last thoughts before we go.
Don't believe everything you see on TV, just like Tanaya has said. And these things that if it brings you a lot of fear, it probably is not true. So best to check with your doctor.
Excellent. And before I hand it over to Karin to close us out, in the name of everybody who did not know anything about transplants, thank you so much for answering the questions and debunking some of the myths in Hollywood. I'll make sure to keep an eye out for any shows, and I'll get back to y'all if I see anything wrong. And Karin, thank you for allowing me the space. I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all 3 of you. This was a fantastic seminar. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed having Daniel actually moderate this so well and learning from Tanaya and from Shelby. So thank you so much. I think that just talking about transplant, even if it's not good, is actually a good step forward. You know, our area, organ transplant, is a field that hasn't been galvanized by people enough. It hasn't had enough space when it comes to the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, medical device market. It hasn't had the financial resources that, for example, oncology and diabetes and autoimmune disease have had. And we need to change that. And the only way I think that we can have an impact, we as Lyfebulb and we as patients and individuals such as Tanaya, is to come together. And I think that's what you said tonight. We really need to speak as one voice. We need to come together through TransplantLyfe. We can gather individuals, we can come up with new ideas, and together we can show that there is a need for better products. Because yes, we are doing organ transplants now. We are saving lives, but we need to do even more so to improve our quality of life and to improve the ways that people with transplants are living going forward. So I think more of these kind of sessions, more TV series and movies about transplant, but let's also talk about living with a transplant, not just the actual surgery. We want to talk about what it's like to live long-term with a transplant. You know, let's have some myths. I'd love to debunk some myths about 15, 20 years with a transplant, because that's where we can see changes also in drug development and more financial resources to the space. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. And if we don't see you before the holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Swansa, and whatever all these holidays are called. So have a wonderful holiday season. Bye.